Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in 1960. While his parents, Lionel and Joyce, had a tumultuous relationship, they both loved him very much and doted on him throughout his first years. As Jeffrey grew out of infancy, his parents' arguments took their full attention, and he was often left feeling alone. Joyce began to spend a lot of time in bed and complained of perpetual weakness when Jeff was around 4 years old. Lionel was going to college and away from home a lot. When he was home, his wife demanded all his attention. Despite trouble at home, Jeffrey was an energetic and happy child during his early school years, at least until around first grade, when he had double hernia surgery. He never seemed to gain any of his energy back, and after that, he became timid and quiet in school and among other children. Teachers were aware of his home life and detected early signs of abandonment issues when Joyce became pregnant with Jeffrey's brother David, and her symptoms worsened. Emotional abandonment is a subjective state where a person feels a loss of emotional connection to someone important to their personal growth. This is especially harmful to children. Jeffrey developed an interest in animal remains while still in elementary school. It began with collecting large insects such as dragonflies and butterflies in glass jars. It soon progresses to small animal carcasses. Lionel told a story in his book, A Father Story, of how he and Jeffrey would find animal skeletons under their home, and it would oddly thrill small Jeffrey. He even carried them around in a toy pail. As a teen, he would take apart skeletons and roadkill and keep the parts in the backyard shed, saying he liked to see how things fit together. Although standoffish and shy, Jeffrey had a small group of friends. In high school, he impressed his friends with wild bouts of flailing and spurts of verbal nonsense. The act became known as doing a Dahmer among the kids, as depicted by this scene from the movie My Friend Dahmer, based on the book by Jeffrey's high school friend John Derf Backderf. He was drinking heavily by age 14 and often carried a concealed flask to school in the pockets of his army jacket. By age 16, Jeffrey had discovered he was gay and began having a recurring fantasy where he took advantage of an incapacitated male. Around this same time, he developed a crush on a man he saw jogging by every day. He waited with a baseball bat in the bushes for him once, but he didn't jog by that day. That man will never know how close he came to living a nightmare. Lionel and Joyce divorced in 1978. Jeffrey graduated from high school despite his largely failing grades, as his mom and brother moved out of the family home to live with relatives. Jeffrey was left alone in the house. He took his first life 3 weeks after high school graduation. Stephen Hicks was hitchhiking to a rock concert when he made the mistake of accepting a ride from Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey promised Stephen a few drinks and some camaraderie, and the two went to Jeffrey's family home. After a few hours, Stephen was ready to leave. Jeffrey was not. Jeffrey struck Stephen on the back of the head with a dumbbell before using it to deprive him of air. Then, he tried to relive his old boyhood fantasy with his remains. He covered the remains with yard debris in the backyard for several weeks before taking them apart, crushing them, and scattering them in the yard. Roughly 6 weeks later, Lionel returned to the family home with his new fiancée. He talked Jeffrey into enrolling in college, an endeavor that only lasted one term before Jeffrey dropped out with a .045 average. He tried the Army next, at Lionel's insistence. Jeffrey enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1979 and was trained as a medical specialist. As a soldier, he maintained average performance, but he excelled in the acquisition of his dark desires. A fact not widely published. Jeffrey, 2 other soldiers while enlisted in the Army, Preston Davis and Billy Joe Capshaw. Davis escaped when he was stationed elsewhere. Capshaw complained, But the Army did not believe him and left him to Jeffrey's sick whims for 17 months as they shared the same room. By 1981, Jeffrey's drinking problem was impairing his performance, and he was honorably discharged from the Army. They offered him a ticket anywhere he wanted to go. He chose Florida, afraid to go home to a disappointed father and claiming he was tired of the cold. Jeffrey got a job at a deli and rented a small room. It didn't last long. Spending all of his checks on booze and none on the rent, he called his dad for bus fare home within 6 months. Jeffrey arrived home and moved in with his father and stepmom, but within 2 weeks, he was in trouble for driving under the influence. Lionel decided then that it was time Jeffrey went to live with his grandma in Wisconsin, a move that would unleash Jeffrey Dahmer's sick and twisted fantasies on an unsuspecting city for more than a decade. Life was good with Grandma at first. Jeffrey was happily doing chores, accompanying Grandma to church, and he even found employment. 1985 rolled around, and Jeffrey had begun to feel those old stirrings again. Soon, he was searching out the area for bars and illicit bookstores. His experiences were unsatisfactory, however, because his partners moved. He preferred them to be completely motionless. He had programmed himself to see each target as an object to use and not a human. So he started to mix substances in their drinks to render them unconscious. Stephen Tuomi met Jeffrey in a Milwaukee bar in 1987. Jeffrey talked him into going to a motel room with him. Jeffrey claims to have no memory of what happened to Tuomi. He said he woke up next to his bruised and battered remains.
I had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here. I was heavily bruised. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
He brought 2 large suitcases and took the remains to his grandmother's house and discarded them. He kept the head wrapped in a sheet for 2 weeks before pulverizing it and scattering it in his grandmother's yard. Jeffrey's sick pastime became secondhand to him at that point. He was a well-oiled machine. It became very easy to find targets in bars and talk them into going back to his grandma's house, where he'd ply them with a doctored drink to render them unconscious and then take them out by asphyxiation. James Dockstader and Richard Guerrero also met the same fate in Grandma's house. Jeffrey got in some trouble for immoral acts with children in 1989. It was while he was awaiting sentencing that he found his 5th target, Anthony Sears. His remains stayed in a locked cabinet while he served a 1-year sentence on a charge involving a teenage boy. In May 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into the Oxford Apartments, number 213, an apartment that would go down in the annals of America's most horrifying locations. The apartment was demolished in 1992. Many neighbors were against it, saying they thought it could provide housing for the poor. Jeffrey took the mummified remains of Sears with him to his new apartment where, within the first 2 weeks, Raymond Smith became the 6th target. As with all his subsequent targets, most of Smith's remains were discarded in the garbage and scattered on the ground, but the skull and a few other parts were kept in his freezer. Neighbors had begun complaining to the apartment manager about the smells coming from Jeffrey's apartment and the late hours he kept with a variety of men. He blamed the odor on his fish tank and spoiled meat in his freezer. In 1990, Edward Smith was the next unsuspecting target to be lured back to Oxford Apartments, never to leave. Ernst Miller was next, then David Thomas. In 1991, Jeffrey saw Curtis Straughter at a bus stop and lured him back to the doomed apartment. Then, Errol Lindsay. By this time, his MO had changed a bit, and he began drilling holes in his target's skulls while they were still alive and pouring acid in. He hoped it would leave them incapacitated in a coma. It never worked as he hoped, and would eventually asphyxiate them while they were unconscious. Sony Hughes was the next target. His remains were still in Jeffrey's bedroom when he brought home Konorak synthasamphone. He incapacitated him and then went to a bar to drink. Konorak escaped, but when police came, Jeffrey showed up and told them it was a lover's quarrel, and they released Konorak into his custody. He was never seen again. During the summer of 1991, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Bradyhoft all met their fateful end with Jeffrey Dahmer. He seemed unstoppable. Tracy Edwards was Jeffrey's final target and the one who took him down. Tracy had agreed to go back to Jeffrey's apartment with him, but was immediately put off by the foul odor and strange vats of acid throughout the apartment. Jeffrey took him by surprise and handcuffed him, but he was able to escape and bring the police back to the apartment. Jeffrey gave up without a fight.
I have no memory of what happened during the 6 hours before the last victim ran out of the apartment. I heard a knock on the door, and the police were there with the last victim.
Police searched his apartment and found the remains in his freezer and vats of acid, along with many photos of the gory activities he enjoyed with the remaining parts.
I am so sorry for that, and sorry for everyone else that I have hurt.
Jeffrey fully confessed to all his actions and was sentenced to 16 terms of life. In 1994, Jeffrey received his final retribution. His cellmate, Christopher Scarver, beat him with a metal bar while on bathroom work detail, ridding the world of Jeffrey Dahmer forever. Do you think Jeffrey's apartment should have been demolished? Would you live there? If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more cool content.